She pointed a rifle at the first man who stopped at her gate. She had good reason to. Her husband was dead, her land was being stolen, and every man in Red Bluff had already decided what was good for her without asking. Then Cole Regan showed up, fixed her fence without permission, slept in her barn without complaint, and started asking the questions no one else had dared to ask about the night Thomas Holt died. He thought he was protecting her by waiting. He was wrong, and the truth he was hiding, the truth buried beneath her own land, was going to change everything she thought she knew about her husband, her home, and the drifter who refused to ride away. Stay with us, because this story does not end where you think it ends. Here on this channel, we tell stories of the American West, stories of love earned through hardship, of mothers who held families together with bare hands, of strangers who became family, and of the quiet courage it takes to trust again after the world has broken your trust. If that is the kind of story that speaks to you, you are in the right place. The truth you hide to protect someone you love has a way of becoming the one thing that stands between you. If Cole and Eliza's story moved something in you, leave a comment below and tell us what you felt. Share this with someone who needs to hear a story about second chances. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe and ring that bell, because we have many more waiting for you.
I'd ridden through 6 territories and 12 towns in 2 years, and I'd gotten good at knowing when to keep moving. Red Bluff, Wyoming should have been one of those towns. I should have watered my horse at the public trough on Main Street, nodded at whoever happened to be watching, and kept riding north toward my brother's place. Simple, clean. The kind of stop that leaves no mark on a man. Instead, I turned down a side road I had no business taking. A rutted track heading west off the main trail, marked by nothing except a leaning post with the faded letters HOLT burned into the wood. I told myself it was habit. 8 years as a Pinkerton detective had left me with the instinct to take the road less obvious, to approach things sideways rather than straight on. That was a lie, and I knew it even then. The truth was simpler and considerably more embarrassing. I'd been riding for 6 hours through country that smelled like dust and dead grass. And when I crested the last hill and saw a farmhouse with smoke coming from the chimney and an orchard of cottonwood trees gone gold with October, something in my chest did a thing it hadn't done in 2 years. It recognized something. I rode down the track toward the gate of Holt's Creek Ranch and pulled up when I saw her. She was on the porch. Red-haired, sharp-eyed, wearing a work dress the color of old saddle leather. She had a rifle up before I'd finished reining in my horse, and she held it the way a person holds something they've held 1,000 times. Naturally, without performance, like it was simply an extension of the decision she'd already made. She said, "Turn around. I've got nothing for drifters, and I've got no patience left for men who think a smile buys them anything on this land." I looked at her. I looked at the rifle. I looked back at her. I said, "Ma'am, I'm just asking for water for my horse." The horse didn't do anything wrong. A silence settled between us, the kind that has weight to it. Then she lowered the rifle. Not all the way, just enough to signal that she'd heard me and hadn't decided yet. She nodded toward a trough at the side of the barn. I dismounted, led my horse to the water, took my time, the way you do when you're trained to observe things without appearing to. The fence on the east side had 3 posts down. The barn hinge was hanging loose, still functional but one hard wind from failure. The wood stacked against the house wall was stacked by someone who knew what they were doing, but had been too exhausted to do it right. No man's boots on the porch, no man's jacket on the hook by the door. A second pair of women's boots, smaller than the ones the red-haired woman was wearing, set neatly beside the front step. 2 women, no men. 400 acres of Wyoming territory. I didn't say any of what I'd noticed. I thanked her for the water, tipped my hat, and rode on. But I looked back before I reached the main road. I couldn't have told you why. I just looked back at that house with its smoke and its broken fence and its red-haired woman standing on the porch watching me go, and something settled in my chest that I hadn't felt since Denver. I didn't know what to do with that, so I filed it away and rode to my brother's place. Silas Regan had been the more sensible of the 2 of us since we were boys. He'd studied law while I'd gone riding off to make my fortune catching criminals for the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. He'd settled in Red Bluff 8 months ago, set up a modest practice, and had been writing me careful letters ever since, suggesting in the polite way of a man who knows his brother well that drifting indefinitely was not actually a life plan. He met me at his gate looking relieved and also like he'd been carrying something heavy for a while. Over whiskey at his kitchen table, he told me about Eliza Holt. Her husband Thomas had died a year ago. Riding accident, the official story said. His horse had apparently stumbled on the canyon road east of the property, and Thomas had gone over the edge. It was a story with problems. The horse in question was a 7-year-old quarter horse that Thomas had trained himself, a horse that had never spooked, never stumbled, never given a moment's trouble in 4 years of hard ranch work. The ground where the accident supposedly occurred was flat approach road, not technical terrain. Nobody in Red Bluff had said any of that out loud. Eliza Holt had spent a year alone with those problems, and no one to say them to. Warren Cade had made his first offer to buy the ranch 2 weeks after the funeral. That detail sat in the room between us like a stone. Silas told me the rest over a second glass. The debt mounting since Thomas's death. The cattle operation running thin. The 2 women, Eliza and her younger sister Clara, holding the property by sheer stubbornness while Cade circled with increasingly generous offers that weren't generous at all. I listened to all of it. Didn't say much. Later, sitting on Silas's porch in the dark, I thought about Denver. About a courtroom 2 years ago and the absolute certainty I'd felt giving testimony. About the sound of a gavel. About a man named Robert Calloway whose face I still saw some nights. Confused and frightened and not guilty. I'd quit the Pinkertons the same afternoon I learned the truth about Calloway. Walked out with my badge in my hand, set it on the desk, and didn't look back. I'd been walking ever since, through 12 towns and 6 territories, telling myself I was done with other people's problems. I looked west toward the dark outline of Holt's Creek 2 miles away. I told myself I was curious, old habit, the detective's instinct that never fully died. That was still a lie, but it was a more comfortable one, and sometimes comfort is what gets you through the night. I rode back to Holt's Creek the next morning. No pretense about water this time. I got off my horse at the fence line, picked up a post that was lying in the dirt, started digging. Eliza came out with the rifle inside of 2 minutes. She said, "I didn't hire you." I said, "No, ma'am, you didn't." "Then what do you think you're doing?" "Fixing a fence post. After that, I'll look at your barn hinge. You've got 3 more posts down on the south side. I can see them from here." The silence that followed was a different kind than the day before. It had calculation in it rather than just wariness. She said, "I'm not a charity case." "Didn't say you were. Room and board for labor isn't charity, it's a transaction." From inside the house came a voice, younger, sharper, with the particular energy of someone who has been waiting for an opportunity. The door opened and a girl of about 19 appeared. She had the same red hair as Eliza, but worn loose, and she looked between us with the assessment of someone considerably older than her years. She pulled Eliza inside. Through the window, I could hear the shape of the conversation, if not the words. After 3 minutes, Eliza came back out alone. She said, 2 weeks, not a day more. You work sunrise to sunset. You sleep in the barn. You don't come inside the house after dark unless I invite you. You don't ask me about Thomas. You don't ask me about the finances. And you don't talk to people in town about what you see here. Agreed. You agreed to that very fast. Because those are reasonable terms. She studied me for a long moment. The rifle was at her side now, but her hand was still on it. "What's your name?" "Cole Regan." "Where are you from, Cole Regan?" "Denver, most recently." Something moved behind her eyes at that, though I couldn't read what it was. "What did you do in Denver?" "Various things. I was good with horses, good with broken things that needed fixing." I picked up the post and held her gaze. "Seems like you've got both." She let me stay. I fixed the east fence that first day, and the barn hinge before dark. It wasn't complicated work, just the kind that required two hands and a working knowledge of how things were supposed to fit together. Eliza watched from a distance, not hovering, just keeping track. Her sister Clara watched more openly, with the frank curiosity of someone who hadn't yet learned to disguise her interest. Clara brought me water at midday without being asked. She was 19 and restless in the way of a person who hasn't yet found the right container for themselves. She said, "Eliza doesn't trust people easy." I said, "I noticed. She's not wrong to. People around here haven't given her much reason." Fair enough. Clara looked at me with those direct eyes. "What are you actually doing here, Cole Regan?" "Fixing fence posts." She didn't believe me. She was right not to, but she let it go. Warren Cade arrived in the late afternoon. He came in a polished black buggy with two men riding behind him on well-fed horses. He was 52 years old, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a coat that had no business being this far from a city. He dismounted with the ease of a man who had never in his life done anything he didn't want to do. He was perfectly pleasant. He called Eliza Miss Holt even though she'd been a widow for a year. He made his offer in a reasonable tone, named a number that was technically generous and practically an insult, and smiled throughout as though he were doing her a considerable favor. Eliza said, "The answer is the same as the last 3 times, Mr. Cade." Cade's eyes moved to me. He studied me with the careful attention of a man who catalogues threats by instinct, assigning each one a value and a probability. "I see you found some assistance. How resourceful." The smile didn't waver. "Red Bluff is a small town, Miss Holt. I do hope your new arrangement doesn't cause you any social difficulty." He left. The pleasantness left with him, like weather changing. I watched the buggy go, and understood 3 things simultaneously. First, Warren Cade was the most dangerous kind of man, the kind who smiled warmly while deciding how much trouble you were going to be. Second, he'd been expecting to find Eliza alone and had not liked finding otherwise. Third, whatever he wanted from this land was worth considerably more to him than the price he'd offered. That evening I settled into the barn. Moving old equipment to clear a sleeping space, I shifted a piece of rotting board behind the feed boxes and found something tucked in the gap behind it, a hand-drawn map. The ink had faded to brown at the edges, but the lines were still clear. The outline of Holt's Creek land. I recognized the shape from the property lines I'd been looking at all day. In the eastern corner of the map, toward where the land ran up against a sandstone canyon, someone had marked a location with careful precision. A circle in darker ink. No label, no explanation. I studied it for a long time. Someone had drawn this deliberately, had hidden it deliberately. The question was whether they'd hidden it to protect it, or whether someone else had hidden it to keep it from being found. I put it back exactly where I'd found it. I lay down on the hay in the corner of Eliza Holt's barn, listened to the Wyoming wind work at the walls, and told myself I was just a man fixing fence posts. I was getting better at believing my own lies. That was either progress or a warning sign. A week passed in the rhythms of hard work. I fixed the south fence, rehung the barn door, restacked the woodpile against the house wall the way it was supposed to be stacked so it wouldn't shift in high wind. I worked the cattle rotation that Thomas had apparently let slide in his final months. Not badly, just a little loose, the way things go when a man has something else on his mind. Eliza and I developed a working silence. It wasn't comfortable yet, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of 2 people paying close attention to each other without admitting to it. Small things accumulated. I noticed Eliza ate standing at the kitchen counter. No time to sit, or maybe the habit of a woman who'd been doing everything alone and had stopped bothering with the rituals of a proper meal. The next morning, when I came in from the early cattle check, there was a plate of food on the porch railing. She didn't mention it. I didn't thank her for it. We both understood the transaction. One evening I saw the light in the barn after dark, a lantern glow through the crack in the door. Eliza sitting alone in there. I didn't go in, didn't call out. I left a cup of coffee outside the barn door and walked back to the house porch to sit in the dark. Next morning, she handed me the empty cup when she passed me in the yard. Our fingers touched for half a second. Neither of us mentioned it. Clara noticed everything and kept her observations to herself with the discipline of someone saving them up. I'd ridden to town twice for supplies, keeping my interactions brief and my questions careful. Red Bluff was the kind of town where people watched strangers and talked about them later. I was already a subject of conversation. I could feel it. The bartender at the saloon knew my name before I introduced myself. The woman at the general store was too carefully incurious. Small-town information moved fast, and someone was making sure it moved toward the right person. I traced Vantage Land and Mineral through the county records office on my second trip to town. It took patience and the particular skill of reading official documents for what they were hiding rather than what they said. The company had commissioned a geological survey of Holt's Creek land 14 months ago, 2 months before Thomas Holt's death. The survey report was not on file. Only the commission record remained, and the name of the geologist hired, a man out of Cheyenne who worked exclusively for private clients. I wrote down everything I found and put it in my saddlebag. Then Roy Sims found me. He was waiting at the edge of town when I rode out, leaning against a fence post with his deputy's badge catching the afternoon light. He was 48, built like a man who'd once been strong and had let it go to something harder and more tired. He had the eyes of someone who'd made a compromise a long time ago and was still paying installments on it. He fell into step beside my horse and said without preamble, "Regan, that's the name, isn't it? Pinkerton man out of Denver." I kept my horse at a walk. "I'm not with the Pinkertons anymore." "No, you're not. Which makes me wonder what a man like you is doing in Red Bluff, fixing fence posts for a widow woman." He let that sit. People who ask too many questions in this town tend to find the answers aren't worth the trouble they bring. That's a friendly warning. He stopped walking. I kept riding. I made it half a mile before the anger came up. Fast and hot and old, the kind I recognized from the worst moments of my Pinkerton years. The anger that wanted resolution through my hands rather than my head. My fists closed on the reins. I pulled up. Sat there for a full 30 seconds thinking about turning back. Then I heard Eliza's voice from behind me. "Don't." I turned. She'd ridden out from the ranch, had apparently seen the whole exchange from the ridge above the road. She pulled up beside me, her expression flat. "Whatever you're thinking, don't." She looked toward where Sims had gone. "This town protects Cade. You start trouble with his deputy, you're in a jail cell or face down in a ditch. Either way, I lose my fence man." I looked at my hands, forced them open. The anger didn't go anywhere. It just stopped moving toward something and stood still. We rode back together without speaking. That night, alone in the barn. The anger was the thing I'd never fully admitted to myself. I'd told myself I left the Pinkertons because I didn't trust my judgment anymore. And that was true. But the deeper truth was this. My judgment had always been driven partly by that anger. The absolute certainty that I was right. The impatience with ambiguity. The desire to resolve things quickly and completely. That certainty had gotten Robert Calloway killed. And standing on that road watching Sims ride away, I understood that the anger hadn't gone anywhere in 2 years. It had just been waiting for something worth being angry about. The question was whether I'd learned anything from Denver, or whether I was just the same man in a different place, making the same mistakes with better intentions. Clara caught me staring at the house that evening from the barn door. She said, "She does this, gets close to something and then runs from it." I said, "Why?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "Because the last time she let herself love someone all the way, she spent a year alone wondering if he was murdered, and nobody would tell her the truth." She went inside. I stood in the barn door looking at the lit windows of the house and understood that what I was feeling was not simply attraction or admiration, though it was both of those things. It was recognition. The particular recognition of one damaged person seeing clearly into another. I went to bed and didn't sleep well. That was becoming a pattern. The storm came in off the sandstone bluffs without warning, the way Wyoming storms do. 1 hour of ordinary October sky. And then the color changed, and the wind shifted, and everything that wasn't tied down became a problem. Eliza and I worked through the evening without discussing it, doing what needed to be done. Moving cattle to the near pasture, securing the barn doors, pulling loose equipment inside, battening the shutters on the house while Clara worked the kitchen against the possibility that the roof might leak. It was brutal, physical work done in the last light before the sky opened up completely. By the time we got inside the barn and pulled the door against the wind, we were both soaked through and past exhaustion. Eliza sat down on an equipment trunk and pushed her wet hair back from her face with both hands. And for the first time since I'd arrived at Holt's Creek, she looked exactly as tired as she was. The lantern made the barn smaller than it was. The rain hit the roof with the sound of something urgent and relentless. After a while, she said without looking at me, "He wasn't a bad man." I didn't move, didn't say anything, just waited. Thomas, he was a good man with a private nature. He kept things separate, compartments, I used to think of them. His work life, his inner life, whatever he was worrying about. I learned not to push at the compartments. He'd come out of them eventually and be exactly the man I'd married. She was quiet for a moment. But the last 6 months, the compartments got bigger. He'd ride out at night and come back before dawn. He was worried, I could see it. But when I asked, he'd just say it was nothing. Everything was fine, so I stopped asking. And she looked at her hands. He died on a Tuesday. The horse came back without him. They found him at the bottom of the East Canyon. They said he must have lost his seat somehow, that the horse had spooked on the road. She said the next words very carefully, like she was setting something fragile down. That horse never spooked in 7 years. Thomas never lost his seat in 20 years of riding. The silence after that had a different quality. Something had been released into the room. "I've never said that out loud before," she said, "to anyone." I thought about whether to tell her, about the map I'd found, about vantage land and mineral, about the pieces I was still assembling. Not yet. I didn't have enough. I told myself that was the reason. Instead, I said, "I put a man in prison on my testimony." I was certain. I had been right about things my whole career, by 8 years of it, and I was always right. This time I wasn't. She looked at me. He was hanged before I found the evidence that cleared him. The rain hammered down. Neither of us spoke for a moment. She said, "And you quit." I walked out the same afternoon, handed in my badge, and kept walking. Do you think that was the right thing to do? Quitting? Nobody had ever asked me that. Not Silas, not the men I'd worked with, not the various bartenders and boarding house keepers who'd heard versions of the story over 2 years of drifting. Nobody had asked if leaving was right. They'd all assumed it was obviously either yes or obviously no. "I think it was the only thing I knew how to do," I said finally. Eliza reached across the space between us. She set her hand over mine. Didn't say anything. Didn't look at me while she did it. Just looked at the barn wall opposite, like it was something her hand had decided without consulting the rest of her. I looked down at her hand. Didn't move. We sat like that while the storm worked at the roof and the lantern made small shadows move on the walls, and I thought that this was the most honest I'd been with anyone in 2 years, and that honesty, it turned out, felt like something extremely dangerous. Then Eliza stood up, said goodnight, went inside. The next morning she was colder than she'd ever been. Not rude. She wasn't a rude person, but she gave me one-word answers at breakfast and wouldn't meet my eyes and moved through the yard on a slightly different path than usual, as though adjusting the geography of the morning to maintain a certain distance. I didn't push, didn't ask. That evening, Clara found me in the barn doing nothing productive and said flatly, "She's afraid." Of what? Of what happened last night, whatever happened. Nothing happened. Something happened. Clara sat down on the trunk where Eliza had sat. You don't know her history with this. Every time she gets close to something real, she pulls back harder than before. It's been that way since Thomas died. Maybe before. She looked at me with those direct 19-year-old eyes. Are you planning to stay, Cole Regan? My agreement is 2 weeks. That's not what I asked. I didn't answer. Clara stood up and went back inside, and I sat with the question for a long time in the barn that smelled like hay and old wood and the particular dry scent of Wyoming after rain. I was still sitting with it when I heard hoofbeats on the road outside. One horse, moving at a cautious pace. By the time I got to the barn door, it had gone. But there was something in the road. I went out and picked it up. A folded piece of paper. No name on the outside. Inside, in handwriting I didn't recognize. Regan, you're asking the right questions. Go see Nora Voss. Tell her Thomas sent you. Thomas Holt had been dead for a year. I stood in the dark road of Holt's Creek with that paper in my hand and felt the whole thing shift under me. The way ground shifts in the moment before an earthquake, when you feel the change before you understand its source. I went back inside. Didn't sleep. I rode to Nora Voss's place the next morning before Eliza was up. The property was smaller than Holt's Creek, 200 acres. Cattle grazed to a fine dust, maintained with the precision of a woman who has been doing everything herself for long enough that she stopped seeing the effort involved. Nora Voss was 64, white-haired, deliberate in all her movements. She answered the door before I knocked, which meant she'd been watching me come down the road. She looked at me for a long moment. "You're the man staying at the Holt place," she said. "Cole Regan. Come in." She poured coffee without asking and set it in front of me and sat across the table with her own cup and her hands folded around it and waited. I said, "Someone told me to come see you, said to tell you Thomas sent me." She set her cup down carefully. "Thomas came to see me 2 weeks before he died," she said. She said it like she'd been waiting for someone to give her a reason to say it. What she told me then took the better part of an hour to tell and several minutes of silence afterward to process. Thomas Holt had found silver. Not suspected it. Confirmed it. He had spent the better part of a year drilling test holes in the eastern canyon of his property, working alone in the early mornings before Eliza was up, carrying samples to a geologist in Laramie, who had confirmed what Thomas had begun to suspect. The silver vein ran deep and consistent. The estimated value was significant enough that the geologist had made Thomas repeat the question of whether he wanted to keep the survey private. Thomas had kept it private. He'd wanted to be certain before he raised Eliza's hopes. He'd wanted to have the claim filed legally and the paperwork in order before he told her anything. He had gone to Cheyenne and filed the mining claim 8 days before he died. "He came to me that night," Nora said. "Said he felt like someone had been watching him. Said he'd seen a rider on the East Ridge twice that week. He asked me to keep a copy of his claim paperwork." She went to the kitchen. She was gone for 2 minutes. When she came back, she was carrying an envelope. Inside was Thomas Holt's original mining claim. Filed legally, witnessed and stamped. Dated 8 days before the riding accident that had killed him on flat ground on a horse that never stumbled. And on the back of the claim, in Thomas's handwriting, 6 words. "W.C. knows. Be careful who you trust. W.C. Warren Cade." I sat at Nora Voss's kitchen table with that envelope in my hands and understood what I was looking at. Not just a document. The reason a good man was dead. The thing he had found and the thing that had gotten him killed for finding it. And underneath the land where his wife was fighting to survive, underneath the debt and the broken fences and the diminishing cattle, the very thing that could have saved all of it. "He trusted you with this," I said. "He trusted me because I'd known him since he was a boy and because I live far enough from town that Cade doesn't consider me worth watching." She folded her hands on the table. "I've kept it a year. I've been waiting for someone to come who could do something with it." "Why didn't you go to the law?" She looked at me with patient eyes. Roy Sims is Cade's man. The sheriff's office in Laramie is 3 days' ride, and I'm an old woman with no money for lawyers and no proof of anything except a piece of paper and what I know. What I know doesn't hold up in court without someone to stand behind it. I rode back to Holt's Creek slowly, letting my horse pick the pace while I worked through what I'd learned. I had the mining claim. I had Nora's account of Thomas's last weeks. I had the Vantage land and mineral connection, which I still needed to trace fully back to Cade. I was close to the full picture, but not there yet, and I had a decision to make about Eliza. She was working in the orchard when I got back, pruning the old cottonwoods that Thomas's mother had planted, doing it with more ferocity than the trees required. She looked up when I came through the gate and read something in my face. "What is it?" I almost told her. Every trained instinct I had said, "Tell her now you have enough. She has the right to know." But the part of me that was no longer just a detective, and the part that had been watching her for 10 days and knew exactly what this information was going to do to her, that part hesitated. I told myself I needed one more day, one more piece. I said, "Nothing yet. Still working on something." She looked at me for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she went back to the pruning. I went to the barn and sat down on the hay with the envelope in my lap and had a conversation with myself that I didn't win. The truth was that I was afraid. Not of Cade. I'd made peace with physical danger years ago. I was afraid of the moment when Eliza Holt found out the full truth about her husband's death, and afraid of my own particular motive for wanting to be the person who was there when it happened. Was I protecting her? Or was I managing the situation, which is what men do when they've decided a woman needs managing, and which is exactly what I'd promised myself I would never do. I didn't sleep well that night either, and the next morning I made the wrong decision. I waited one more day. I told her everything the following morning. I sat down across from her at the kitchen table, the first time I'd been inside the house, and I put the envelope between us and told her all of it. The map I'd found in the barn, Vantage land and mineral, the geological survey commissioned 2 months before Thomas died, Nora Voss and what she'd been keeping for a year, the mining claim, the 6 words on the back. Eliza listened without moving, without speaking. She read the claim twice. She read the 6 words on the back. She set the paper down flat on the table with both hands. Then she said, "How long have you known?" I didn't look away. "Parts of it, a week. All of it since yesterday morning." The silence was worse than anything she might have shouted. "You sat at my table." Her voice was very controlled. "You slept in my barn. You listened to me talk about Thomas in that storm, and you knew. You knew, and you decided I wasn't ready to hear it." "Eliza, don't." She stood up. "I told you things I haven't told anyone. About the horse, about the canyon. I trusted you with that. And you were already deciding what I needed to know and when I needed to know it. I was trying to get the full picture before That is exactly what every man in this town has been doing for a year." Her voice stayed level, which was worse than if it had broken. "Deciding what I can handle. Deciding what's good for me. I expected it from Cade. I did not expect it from you, Cole Regan." I didn't argue, didn't make excuses. I had them, but they weren't good enough, and we both knew it. "You're right," I said. "I made the wrong call. I made it because I was afraid of watching you break, and that's not a sufficient reason. There isn't one." She walked out of the kitchen. I sat at her table for a few minutes, then went outside. I rode to Silas's place and told him what I'd found. Silas went white, not with surprise. With the particular pallor of someone who has been dreading a conversation for a long time and has finally been found by it. He already knew about Vantage land and mineral. He had done legal work for Cade's firm 8 months ago, reviewed contracts, drafted correspondence, processed the kind of paperwork that a man with his eye on land acquisition generates constantly. He had seen the Vantage land and mineral filings. He had understood what they pointed toward. He had not known about a murder, only suspected that something was wrong. He had left Cade's firm. He had said nothing. 8 months, I said. You suspected. And you stayed quiet for 8 months, while a widow tried to hold 400 acres together by herself. I didn't know he'd killed anyone. You suspected, and you were afraid of what Cade would do to you if you spoke. So you didn't speak. Silas couldn't answer that. He sat at his table with his law books and his careful life around him, and he had no answer, because there wasn't one. I've been carrying a dead man's photograph for 2 years, I said, because I made the wrong call in Denver. I know what it looks like when a man is carrying something he should have put down a long time ago. You've been carrying this, Silas, and Eliza Holt has been paying the cost of it. I rode back to Holt's Creek as the sun went down. Eliza had not taken back her dismissal, but she hadn't locked the gate either, and the porch lantern was lit. I took that for the only grace available and unsaddled my horse. I was halfway through that when I smelled smoke. The grain storage shed on the east side of the yard, orange light moving in the gap under the door. Someone had put a torch to the east wall, not accidental, not lightning, not any of the explanations a person reaches for first. Deliberate. I shouted. Eliza came out of the house in under a minute with her hair loose and her boots half-laced. Clara was right behind her. We worked for an hour with buckets and wet canvas in the smoke. All three of us, no discussion. Just the immediate language of a fire that needed fighting. We saved most of the grain. The east wall was gone. The structure itself held. When it was over, we stood in the yard, covered in ash, and none of us spoke for a moment. Eliza looked at me across the smoke. She was sooty and exhausted, and her eyes were red from the smoke and from something else she wasn't going to name. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She didn't forgive me. I hadn't earned it yet. But she left the gate unlocked and the lantern burning. And when you have done something wrong, sometimes that small continuing mercy is all the grace you're going to get. That night, I wrote a letter to Silas. I told him we needed to move. We needed his lawyer contacts in Laramie. We needed to reach someone in the federal court system who operated outside of Cade's influence. We needed to move before Cade decided that a shed fire wasn't enough of a message. I sealed the letter and lay down in the hay. Above me, through the gap in the barn roof I'd been meaning to patch, the Wyoming stars were unreasonably bright. 3 days after the fire, Silas came to Holt's Creek. He came with his hat in his hands and his head down, and he stood in Eliza's kitchen doorway and said without preamble, "I should have come to you 8 months ago. I didn't. I have no excuse that stands up." He set a folder on the table. "But I can make up for lost time. I've got a contact, Federal Judge Hargrove in Laramie. He's been looking for something usable against Cade for 3 years. Jurisdiction issues kept him out. A murder charge changes jurisdiction." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at me. I said, "It's the best option we have." "What do we need?" Silas laid it out. He would take the mining claim and Nora's written account to Laramie. He would also take the vantage land and mineral documentation. Eliza would continue running the ranch normally. No indication that anything had changed, no sign that we were building a case. Cole would stay close. "How long?" Eliza asked. "A week, maybe less if Hargrove moves fast." Eliza nodded once. "Go." Silas left the next morning at first light. 2 mornings after that, I came in from the early cattle check and found Eliza on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. She held one out without ceremony. I took it and sat down beside her, not across from her, beside. She said, "I'm still angry at you. I know. You should have told me sooner." "Yes. The fact that you came back when the shed caught doesn't cancel that out." "No, it doesn't." She looked at the horizon. The particular red that Wyoming does in early morning when the light comes in low over the dust flats and turns everything the color of something almost too beautiful to look at directly. "But you came back," she said. "I was always going to come back." She turned and looked at me for a long moment. Then she leaned forward and kissed me. Not gently, not tentatively, deliberately, the way a person does something they've thought through and decided to do. Her hand came up and rested against the side of my face. When she pulled back, she said, "Don't make me regret that." I'll spend considerable energy on that goal, I said. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. That evening, Clara came to find me in the barn. She sat down on the equipment trunk with a look on her face that was older than 19. "I need to tell you something," she said. She told me about Danny Sims, Roy Sims's son, 19 years old, who'd been meeting Clara on the South Road for the past month. Clara had liked him, had thought he was different from his father, had met with him 2 nights ago to say goodbye because she'd seen enough of what his father was and didn't want to spend her life worrying about which way Danny would fall. She had told Danny why. Had mentioned that Silas had gone to Laramie, had mentioned that Cole had found evidence. Danny had told her it would stay between them. I looked at Clara and she already knew. "He told his father," she said. Her voice was flat. "Didn't he?" "Probably within the hour." "I'm sorry." She said it directly, without self-pity. "I made a mistake. I thought he was different." "He might be different eventually. He wasn't different yet." Clara looked at her hands. "What does this mean for us?" "It means Cade knows his time is short. When men like Cade feel time running out, they stop being patient." I spent that night watching the road from the barn loft. Nothing came. The note arrived the next morning. Thrown from horseback at the first light of dawn, it landed on the porch step. Eliza found it. She read it once and brought it inside and set it on the table without a word. It said, "Mrs. Holt, your sister is safe and comfortable. She will stay that way. Sign the deed transfer and bring it to the Red Bluff Land Office before sunset. Come alone. Miss Clara will be returned to your gate by nightfall. Any involvement of law enforcement changes the terms. W.C." Clara was gone, her bed empty, her boots missing from beside the front step. Eliza stood at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface, and her face doing 5 things in 10 seconds, and settling into something that had the quality of iron. "He took her in the night," she said, "while I was watching the road. He came from the south field." I was already thinking through the terrain. "There's an abandoned relay station 4 miles northeast. He used it 2 years ago when he was buying up the Henderson land. I found a reference to it in the land records. I know how to approach it without being seen from the road." "Then go get my sister." "Eliza, I am not signing that deed." Her voice left no room. "And I am not losing Clara. So go get her." She looked at me with those clear eyes that had looked at me over the barrel of a rifle on the first day and had been recalibrating their judgment of me ever since. "I'm not certain this works," I said. "I know that. There's a real possibility it goes wrong." "I know that too." She held my gaze. "I'm asking you anyway." I'd been asked to do hard things by people with authority over me for 8 years. Judges and marshals and railroad men, people with legal power and institutional weight behind them. I'd done most of those things without hesitation. This was different. Eliza Holt had no authority over me. She was asking me because she trusted me. After everything I'd done wrong, after the withholding and the wrong calls and the pride that had made me think I knew better, she still trusted me. That was the only answer that mattered. I left my horse half a mile from the relay station and went in on foot. 2 hours of careful movement across broken terrain in the dark, using the gullies, staying below the ridge lines, moving only when the wind moved and covering ground in the pauses. Old habits. 8 years of them, and they came back without effort. The relay station was a low stone building with a sod roof and 1 window in each wall. Light came through the south window, a lantern inside, not trying to hide. They weren't expecting anyone to find them. That was useful. I circled the building twice before I approached, reading the situation. 1 man inside with Clara. I could see his silhouette through the south window, pacing, nervous. Clara was sitting against the far wall, hands bound in front of her, head up, not broken, waiting. Roy Sims. I recognized the silhouette. I went in through the back. The door there had a broken latch, which I'd noted in the land records as deferred maintenance. I lifted the door in its frame to clear the catch and pushed through without sound. Sims was facing the window. Clara saw me over his shoulder. She didn't react. Good girl. I had 3 seconds to decide how to handle this. I could go physical. Sims was armed, but he was jumpy, and I had the angle. Or I could try something harder. "Roy," I said quietly. He spun, hand to his gun, not drawing yet. "Don't," I said. "Listen to me first. Regan, you're not a killer. I've been watching you for 2 weeks, and I know what a killer looks like. You made a compromise a long time ago, and you've been paying it back ever since." I kept my voice low and steady. "You know what happens to the men who know too much once Cade doesn't need them anymore. You've been in this long enough to know the answer to that." Sims's hand dropped slightly, and then the front door opened. Warren Cade walked in with 2 hired men behind him. He looked at the tableau. Sims with his hand on his gun, me in the middle of the room, Clara against the wall. And he understood it all in an instant. He said, "Roy, outside." Sims went. Cade sat down on a crate with the unhurried air of a man who had been in this position before and found it familiar. He looked at me with something that might, under different circumstances, have been respect. "More persistent than I expected," he said. One of his hired men had my gun. I was unarmed and outnumbered, and the door was behind Cade. The math was straightforward. Cade talked. He'd decided we weren't leaving this station alive, which meant he had no reason to be careful. "I grew up in a charity house in Missouri," he said. 8 years old when my parents died in the winter of '51. Everything I have I built. Thomas Holt spent 30 years on land his father gave him and found silver underneath it by accident. One afternoon's paperwork and he would have had something he didn't earn. "He was born on that land," I said. "He earned it by staying. I've met 100 men born to something. None of them made anything worth keeping." He said it without heat. That was the worst part. He genuinely believed it. "I removed an obstacle. The same way you removed obstacles for the Pinkertons, Regan. You just used a courtroom instead of a canyon." The silence after that was like something falling. He wasn't wrong about the comparison. I'd been certain. I'd been so trained and so confident in my own read of a situation that I'd sent a man to his death without looking for the way I might be wrong. The difference between me and Warren Cade was not that I was a good man and he was a bad one. The difference was what we'd done when we found we were wrong. He'd never had to find out. I was not going to die in this relay station. Not because I deserved to live. I'd been uncertain about that for 2 years. But because there was a woman 4 miles south of here who'd kissed me like a decision, and I had not yet become worth that decision. I needed to become worth it. Clara had been working the knot on her wrists since she'd seen me come through the back door. Thomas had taught her to tie knots, had taught her by extension to untie them. She'd gotten her hands free 3 minutes into Cade's speech. She reached into her boot. The folding knife was small. It was enough. She cut my hands free from behind while Cade's hired men were watching their employer hold court. I had a 4-second window. I went through the window. Clara went through the window 6 inches behind me. A pistol barrel caught my shoulder as I cleared the frame. Not a shot, a strike, and something cracked that would need attention later. I kept moving. We ran. 2 miles in the dark with shouts behind us and the sound of horses being saddled. Clara Holt ran like someone who had decided that she would not be the reason her sister lost everything. She didn't make a sound the whole 2 miles. Not a word, not a breath, wasted. When the lights of Holt's Creek came into view, she said, between full strides, "Thank you." I said, "You cut the rope." We both needed out. Fair point. We came through the gate at a run, and Eliza was on the porch with the rifle across her knees, exactly where she'd been all night. She saw us coming, saw Clara upright and moving, saw my arm held wrong against my side. She didn't run to us. She waited on the porch, and when we reached the steps, she pulled Clara in with one arm and held her sister without speaking for a long time. Then she looked at me over Clara's shoulder. She didn't need to say anything. Neither did I. But Cade would come here next, and we all knew it. They came at first light. Warren Cade rode up to the gate of Holt's Creek with 4 hired men positioned at the compass points of the property. A formal siege, done in the open air of a Wyoming morning, with the particular confidence of a man who has always won. He rode alone to the gate. His coat was still immaculate. His hat was perfectly placed. He looked like a man conducting a business transaction. "Mrs. Holt," he said, "I want to be reasonable about this. Sign the transfer and I'll be off your property within the hour. No one needs to be hurt." Eliza walked to the gate. I walked beside her. Cade looked at me with something that had shifted from assessment to irritation. "You should have stayed down," he said. "Tell me how many men you've killed," I said. "I want to know what reasonable is worth to you." Cade's pleasant expression stayed in place, but his eyes went cold. Then Roy Sims rode down the road. He came from the direction of town. He stopped his horse between Cade's hired men and the gate, and he sat there for a moment looking at Cade with the face of a man who has made up his mind after a long time of not being able to. He reached up and unpinned his badge, set it on his saddle horn, let it fall into the dust. Cade said, "Roy." Sims said, "I sent a letter to Judge Hargrove in Laramie 2 weeks ago, before any of this started." His voice was steady. "I told him what I knew about the Vantage survey, about Thomas Holt, about what I saw on the East Ridge the night Thomas died." Complete silence. Even the wind stopped. "I saw you," Sims said, "on the ridge above the East Canyon. I saw your horse and Thomas's horse, and then I only saw yours." Cade's hired men looked at each other. "Thomas Holt pulled a stranger's wagon out of a ditch in a blizzard in '71, Sims continued. "Stayed with them 4 days till they could move. Didn't ask for anything. Didn't talk about it after. That stranger was my wife's brother." He looked at Eliza now, not at Cade. "I owed Thomas. I paid it late. But I paid it." I looked at Eliza. She was not looking at Cade or Sims. She was looking at me. In the middle of this standoff, with 4 armed men at the edges of her property, and her sister behind her in the house, she was looking at me with an expression I'd been trying to earn for weeks. I thought, this is what it means to be inside something instead of observing it. This is what I'd been walking away from for 2 years. Not because I didn't want it, because I didn't believe I deserved to be here. I thought, whether I deserve it or not, I am here, and I am not going anywhere. A wagon came down the road from the north, Silas driving. Nora Voss sitting beside him, straight-backed and deliberate, like a woman who has made a decision and is not going to revisit it. And behind the wagon, a rider in the coat of a federal marshal. Silas had reached Laramie. Hargrove had moved fast. Sim's letter had been sitting on his desk for 2 weeks, like a lit fuse. Nora stepped down from the wagon without assistance. She walked past Cade's hired men like they were fence posts. She stopped 10 feet from Cade himself. "I was coming home from the McCready place the night Thomas Holt died," she said. "Late. My lantern had gone out. I was on foot on the ridge road, and no horse, no light. I was invisible." She held Cade's gaze without flinching. "You weren't." Cade said nothing. His face had gone still in the way of a man doing rapid calculations and not liking the results. "I kept quiet a year because I thought no one would believe an old woman over Warren Cade," Nora said. She turned to Eliza. "Your husband was trying to protect you, right up to the end. He deserved better than what happened to him. I'm sorry I waited so long to say that." Eliza said, "You're saying it now." Cade reached inside his coat. He came out with a folded paper, the deed transfer already prepared, and held it out toward Eliza. "This is still the cleanest resolution," he said, and his voice had finally lost its pleasantness. "The courts will tie this up for years. Sign this, take the money, and walk away from it." Eliza walked toward him. 1 step, 2 steps. Close enough to take the paper. She took it, looked at it. Then she tore it in half, then in half again. Let the pieces fall into the Wyoming dust at her feet. "My husband earned this land," she said. "His mother planted the orchard on it. My sister grew up on it." She looked at Cade directly. "You don't get to put a number on that." Something broke in Cade's face. Just once, just briefly, the control cracking at one seam. His hand went back inside his coat. The federal marshal moved. It was over quickly. Cade's hired men made the calculation that 4-to-1 odds don't hold up against federal authority and the law of consequences, and they held very still while the marshal did his work. When it was done, we went inside. The marshal laid out the documents on Eliza's kitchen table. Silas stood beside him and explained the legal architecture in plain language. Thomas's mining claim, filed 8 days before his death, had been illegally suppressed. A clerk in the Cheyenne Land Office on Cade's payroll had buried the filing in a backlog and never processed it. The clerk was already in custody. The filing was valid. The claim was valid. The silver mine beneath the eastern canyon of Holt's Creek belonged to Eliza Holt, legally, completely, with interest on everything that had been wrongfully withheld. Eliza sat at the table and held the document with both hands. Clara stood behind her with one hand on her shoulder and didn't say a word. Thomas Holt had found the thing that could have saved everything. He'd gone about it quietly, carefully, alone because he wanted to be certain before he gave his wife hope. He'd been careful right up to the moment. He couldn't be anymore. He didn't get to see it come right. But it came right. I stood in the doorway of Eliza Holt's kitchen with my shoulder cracked and my boots covered in Wyoming dust, and I watched a woman receive justice that was a year overdue, and I thought about the difference between deserving something and getting it. Sometimes those things align. Sometimes you have to fight to make them align. Sometimes the people you love fight for you after you're gone. 3 weeks later. Cade was in federal custody in Laramie awaiting trial. Sims had given his full testimony. The clerk from the Cheyenne Land Office had done the same. Roy Sims would receive a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation. It would be years in court. Eliza had been honest with herself about that from the beginning. But the land was hers, and the claim was hers, and no one was going to take either one. The lawyers were moving. The mine was being assessed by a legitimate firm in Cheyenne, negotiations handled by Silas, every document reviewed by Eliza twice before she signed anything. She and I had been working the ranch in a new rhythm. Easier, but with something still sitting between us. Not tension. More like a conversation that had been interrupted, and neither of us had found the right moment to resume. I asked her one evening if she had time to talk. We sat on the porch, the sun going down over the Wyoming flats, the orchard throwing long shadows across the yard, the air carrying the particular cold of October that told you winter was serious about arriving. I told her the whole Denver story, not the version I'd given her in the barn during the storm, the real version. I told her Robert Calloway's name. I told her the shape of the case, the evidence I'd had, the certainty I'd felt. I told her what the verdict had looked like from the witness stand, and what it had looked like 6 weeks later when a different piece of evidence arrived and the certainty collapsed. I've told myself 100 different stories about why it happened, I said. That I was overworked, that the evidence was genuinely ambiguous, that any reasonable man would have made the same call. Were those stories true? Some of them, mostly. But I was certain. I had always been certain, and I'd never been wrong before. So I looked for the way I was right instead of the way I might be wrong. And I found what I was looking for. That's the most dangerous kind of mistake, the kind that feels exactly like success. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Thomas kept secrets from me because he was certain it was the right thing to do, she said. He was certain that protecting me meant keeping me in the dark. Being certain isn't the same as being right. But it doesn't make you a bad man, Cole. It makes you a man who was wrong once. That's different. I know the difference, I said. I just haven't always felt it. She looked at her hands. Then she looked at me. I'm not going to tell you that I need you here, she said. I ran this land alone for a year. I can keep running it. I know you can. I'm also not going to pretend I don't want you to stay, because I've got no patience left for games, and I'm well past the age for them. I looked at her. What are you saying, Eliza? I'm saying, do you want to stay? Not because you owe the universe something for Denver. Not because you feel responsible for what happened here. Because you want to be here, on this land, in this life, next to me. The porch, the orchard, the red dust going dark in the evening light. Wyoming spreading out in every direction like something that had never been interrupted. I want to stay, I said. I've wanted to stay since the second morning when I picked up a fence post without being asked. Then stay. It was the most direct conversation about a future I'd ever been part of. No ceremony to it, no performance. Just two people who'd been through something hard and come out the other side knowing what mattered. 3 things happened in the weeks that followed, and each one closed something that had been open. Clara came to find me in the barn the week before the wedding. She sat down across from me and said, I knew Danny Sims was wrong before you said anything. I just didn't want to stop. Why? Because I watched Eliza love Thomas completely. And then he was gone. And I watched what the year after did to her. How alone she was. How she just kept going and never stopped, because if she stopped, she'd have to feel all of it. Clara looked at her hands. I decided I was never going to love anyone enough to end up like that. And now? Now I watched her fight for this land and find someone worth trusting, and she looks like herself again. Better than herself. She paused. I had it backwards. Loving less doesn't protect you. It just means you lose something without ever having it. She had applied to a nursing program in Laramie. She was leaving in 6 weeks. She'd told Eliza the night before, and Eliza had cried for the first time since the night in the barn during the storm. Not from grief, from something more complicated and more true. Take care of her, Clara said. She doesn't need taking care of. No, but she deserves someone who would anyway. That's different. She stood up. I know the difference now. The second thing, Silas and I had one last real conversation sitting on his porch 2 days before the wedding. You stayed quiet because you were afraid, I said. Yes, I understand that better than I'd like to. I know you do. He met my eyes. I'm staying in Red Bluff. Independent practice. I've got 3 clients already. People Cade was squeezing for years who finally have somewhere to go. That's useful. It's what I can do. He paused. I wrote a letter to one of Calloway's daughters in Kansas City. Told her that her father's name had been brought up in a federal case and that the record should be corrected. Told her I knew a man who'd been wanting to write for 2 years. I looked at him. Her name is Evelyn, he said. She wrote back. She said if the man wants to write, he should write. The third thing I did alone. The evening before the wedding, I went to the barn. I took the photograph from my breast pocket. Robert Calloway outside the Denver courthouse, 44 years old, confused and frightened and not guilty, and I sat with it for a long time. Then I wrote the letter. The real one. Not the 17 drafts I'd started and stopped. I told Evelyn Calloway who I was and what I'd done, and that I had spent 2 years not being able to say it directly to anyone, and that I was sorry in a way that didn't ask for anything in return. I sealed the letter, set it with the things going to town. Then I went to the corner of the barn where the old cottonwood grew. The tree that had been there before the barn was built around it, older than any of us, rooted down past the hard clay into something permanent and cool. I dug a small hole at its base. I placed the photograph inside. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the act didn't already say better. I filled the hole back in and smoothed the dirt over it. I wasn't done carrying Robert Calloway. I understood that. But I didn't have to carry him like a punishment anymore. I could carry him the way Eliza carried Thomas. Not as a wound that wouldn't close, but as a weight that had made her what she was and would always be part of her, changed in form, but not diminished in meaning. The wedding was small, the right size. Judge Hargrove made the trip from Laramie. He told Silas he owed him a favor and was glad to have a good reason to pay it. Silas stood up with me. Clara stood with Eliza. Nora Voss sat in the front row in a dress that suggested she'd been saving it for an occasion worth wearing it to. A handful of neighboring families came, people who'd spent years being careful around Cade and were slowly learning what it felt like to stop being careful. Eliza wore a dress the color of the Wyoming sky at mid-morning. Not quite blue, not quite gray, something in between that didn't have an easy name. Her hair was down. We wrote our own vows, short ones. She said, "I choose you." Not because you arrived at the right time. You arrived at a terrible time and made yourself useful anyway. I choose you because you told me the truth when it cost you something. Because you came back when the shed was burning. Because you looked at me like I was someone worth looking at. She paused. I've spent enough of my life doing things because I had to. I want to do this because I want to. I choose you, Cole Regan. I said, I've been wrong about things that mattered. I'll probably be wrong again. I can't promise you I'll always make the right call. But I promise I will always come back. I will tell you the truth even when it's inconvenient for me. And I will never, as long as I live, decide what you can handle and keep the rest from you. She smiled. Not almost smiled. Smiled. I slid the ring onto her finger. I said, You are the most clear-eyed person I've ever met. I think I knew it the first time you told me to turn around. You didn't turn around, she said. No, I didn't. Best decision I've made in 2 years. 1 year later, Holt's Creek in autumn again. The mining operation was underway in the Eastern Canyon. A legitimate partnership, clean contracts, Eliza's signature required on every decision. The debt was gone. The barn had a new east wall. The orchard was producing better than it had in years, something Clara had arranged with the fruit before she left for Laramie, a parting gift that kept giving. I managed the cattle operation. It turned out that running a cattle ranch and running a covert investigation had more in common than you'd expect. Both required patience, attention, and the willingness to sit with uncertainty until the answer revealed itself. I was better at the patience now than I'd been. Living with Eliza Holt was good training for that. Silas came to dinner twice a month. He was building something real in Red Bluff. Slow, careful, the way good things get built. Clara wrote letters from Laramie. Long ones, full of observations about her patients and her instructors and the city, which she found both overwhelming and irresistible. Nora Voss came for Sunday coffee every 2 weeks. She slept better now. She'd said so herself, with the direct simplicity of a woman who had stopped pretending things were fine when they weren't. A man came down the main road one afternoon on a tired horse and stopped at our gate. I was in the barn. Eliza was on the porch. The man looked like I'd looked a year ago. Dusty, uncertain, the particular air of someone who's been riding a long time and isn't sure what they're looking for. I watched through the barn door. Eliza stood up, walked to the gate, opened it. You need water? Trough's at the side of the barn. Help yourself. The man thanked her, rode in, watered his horse, tipped his hat, and rode out 20 minutes later. Eliza came back to the porch and sat down beside me. I'd come out of the barn and settled into the chair next to hers. You didn't bring the rifle, I said. She looked at the road where the man had gone. Then she looked at the orchard, the barn, the new east wall, the smoke from the chimney making its unhurried way into the blue October sky. Didn't need it. We sat on that porch while the sun went all the way down and the first stars appeared over Wyoming. The particular stars you only get at that altitude, the ones that look close enough to touch. I asked her once, much later, what had changed. Why she no longer met the world rifle first. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, thoroughly, without rushing to an answer. I think I spent a long time being ready for the worst thing, she said. Ready for people to take from me, or lie, or leave. And being ready for it all the time is exhausting. It makes you see the worst thing even when it isn't there. And now, she looked at me. Now I've got something worth protecting. That's different from being afraid of losing everything. It feels different. She paused. Lighter. I stayed quiet. I'd learned, living with Eliza Holt, that the best thing to do when she said something worth keeping was to let it settle without covering it with more words. We sat until the dark was complete and the ranch was quiet around us, and the cottonwood in the barn corner was a dark shape against a darker sky, rooted down past the clay into something that didn't move. I thought about 12 towns in 2 years, about a man named Robert Calloway, and a letter I'd finally sent, and a reply I'd received that was harder to read than anything I'd expected, and more necessary than anything I'd known. About a rifle in a red-haired woman's hands on an October morning, and the look on her face that first day, hard and tired and entirely unintimidated by whatever I thought I was. I thought about the fence post I'd picked up without being asked, about a barn in a storm and 2 people telling each other the truth for the first time in longer than either of them wanted to admit, about a woman who'd kissed me like a decision and meant it. I thought, I have been somewhere on purpose for the first time in 2 years. I thought, this is what home feels like when you've been long enough without it to know the difference. I thought, the road that brought me here was long and wrong in most of the ways a road can be wrong. I'd made mistakes on it that cost more than I could fully repay. I'd wasted time and carried things I should have set down sooner and been wrong with a certainty that still made me quiet on certain nights. But the road had brought me here, to this porch, to this woman, to this life that was harder and more particular and more worth the having than anything I could have planned. Eliza set her hand over mine on the arm of the chair. Didn't say anything. Didn't need to. I turned my hand over and held hers. Above us, the Wyoming stars did what Wyoming stars do, burned with unreasonable brightness in a sky too clear and too wide to fully take in, the kind of sky that makes a person feel small in the good way, the way that means you are part of something larger than yourself rather than lost in it. The wind came off the bluffs. The orchard moved. The house behind us held its warmth against the October night. Eliza Holt. Eliza Regan now, though she still signed everything with both names, which was right, sat beside me on the porch of the land her husband had died trying to protect, the land she had fought to keep, the land that was hers in every way that mattered. And I sat beside her. Not because I'd arrived at the right time, not because I was the right man in any uncomplicated sense, but because I'd picked up a fence post without being asked, and stayed when it would have been easier to go, and told the truth when it cost me something, and come back when the shed was burning. And because she had chosen me, in full knowledge of what I was and what I'd done and what I still carried. That choice, freely made by a clear-eyed woman who didn't need anyone to make it for her, that was the thing I would spend the rest of my life becoming worthy of. I was already working on it. It was worth the ride. This work is a creation of the author's imagination, designed to entertain and provoke thought. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely accidental. The author assumes no responsibility for interpretations that connect fictional elements to real-world entities.
The story of Holt's Creek is, at its heart, not just a tale of justice and survival in the harsh American frontier, but a deeply human exploration of trust, redemption, and the courage to confront truth. Through the journey of Cole Regan and Eliza Holt, we are reminded that the past may shape us, but it does not have to define the limits of who we become. One of the central meanings of the story lies in redemption. Cole Regan begins as a man burdened by guilt, haunted by a grave mistake that cost an innocent life. Instead of facing his past, he runs from it, drifting from town to town. However, when he arrives at Holt's Creek, he is given an opportunity not to erase his past, but to respond to it differently. By choosing to stay, to help, and ultimately to tell the truth even when it costs him trust, Cole begins the long process of redeeming himself. The story suggests that redemption is not achieved through grand gestures alone, but through consistent, honest choices made over time. Another key theme is the importance of truth and transparency. Eliza's anger toward Cole does not come from the danger surrounding them, but from the fact that he withheld the truth. This moment is crucial because it reveals that even good intentions cannot justify deception. The moral lesson here is clear. Trust is built not on protection or control, but on honesty. When we decide for others what they can or cannot handle, we take away their agency. True respect means allowing others to face reality, no matter how difficult it may be. The story also highlights the destructive nature of greed and the abuse of power. Warren Cade represents a man who believes that success justifies any action, even murder. His worldview contrasts sharply with that of Thomas Holt, who worked honestly and quietly, and Eliza, who fights with integrity. Through this conflict, the narrative teaches us that while power may dominate temporarily, justice supported by courage and truth can ultimately prevail. Equally important is the idea of courage, not just physical courage, but moral courage. Characters like Roy Sims and Nora Voss demonstrate that doing the right thing often comes late and at great personal cost, but it still matters. Their decisions to speak the truth help bring justice, proving that it is never too late to correct a wrong. Finally, the story offers a profound lesson about love and vulnerability. Clara's realization that loving less does not protect us from pain, but only deprives us of something meaningful is one of the most powerful messages. Eliza, despite her losses, chooses to trust again. Cole, despite his guilt, chooses to stay. Their relationship is not built on perfection, but on honesty, accountability, and choice. Love, in this story, is not a refuge from hardship, but a commitment to face it together. In conclusion, Holt's Creek teaches us that a person is not defined by their worst mistake, but by what they do afterward. It reminds us that truth is the foundation of trust, that justice requires courage, and that love demands vulnerability. Above all, it shows that even in a harsh and unforgiving world, people can choose integrity, and that choice can change everything.